friends in Warren. And so we're really glad to have you, Bob, and you just take it over and do what your thing, okay?
Sure thing, absolutely. Well, thank you guys, first of all, for having me. I think the last time I was here, obviously I was showing, I think, a documentary on the Saline, I believe was what we were showing. I've done several films in the last few years. Of course, I worked in film for a long time. I've kind of taken a step back from that since then. A lot's changed in my life. First of all, I'm married now. My wife wanted to be here. She's enjoying the sands of Mexico this past week, though, so she couldn't make it. But my life kind of took a tumble last summer. Mom had heart surgery, so we've all kind of been chauffeuring her around. So she decided to join me today. She used to paint. She's kind of the person that got me into it to start with. My history with art is a relatively short path, all things considered, but it's been a little winding road, so to speak. I started off, didn't touch any paint with a brush until I was a senior in high school. Didn't really have any interest in drawing, nothing like that. I had to take a required senior level art class, and we did a watercolor, just a really cheap watercolor, and I liked it. So I came home. I knew my mom had a few canvases in her closet that I'd seen. So I asked her, would you teach me what you know? And yeah, she already knows where this is going. She says, no, you have no patience. You can't do it. I'm not going to teach you. So she held that up for about a month to 2 months, and finally I broke her down, and she did finally teach me a few things that she could teach at the time. And you'd been out of it for a while, I think, at that point. I think since she was maybe in her 20s, she hadn't painted since then. So this was probably about 11, 12 years ago, something like that. Because I graduated from high school in 2006, and so it's been a little while. But anyway, she kind of at that point taught me as much as she could teach me. I went off to college to Arkansas State, was majoring in history. And finished out my history degree, but in 4 years I didn't touch a canvas again. I never, all of my oil paints hardened. There was nothing left when I got back. So I was still very much a beginner painter after college. But when I came back home, it took another couple of years before I got back into it. We took a trip out west one summer, and when I got back, I was moving into my first house. Remodeling it, and I had no art on the walls at all. And I liked art. I'd been to the Smithsonian. I'd seen top-notch art. I'd seen Winslow Homer. I'd seen really nice stuff, and I liked it. I knew I enjoyed art, and I, in fact, bought a couple of pieces just to start a collection. But still couldn't afford the really nice stuff that I was seeing that I wanted to own. So I just started painting. I just thought, well, I'll go to Hobby Lobby and buy a canvas and see what I can do, and that sort of kicked off an addiction, I guess is what we can call it. And I've been painting ever since. Now, in the last couple of years, it's really picked up in my life. I wasn't serious about it until about 2 years ago. And what happened, I finished up a movie that I'd been working on, and after that was done with, I was burned out of film, and I still am to a certain extent. Film is so expensive, it's so difficult to get people together to do it, and when you've worked on a movie with 100 actors, being in the solitude of the studio or outside painting is heaven. You know, it really can be. And when you've dealt with that many personalities, I loved it. Don't get me wrong, I love working in film, but I think that may be behind me. But I'd met, at that point, about 2 years ago, I'd met a gentleman by the name of Ken Vale. He was from Banks, Arkansas originally, and he's probably in his late 40s to early 50s right now. And Ken was living in Texas when I met him, but about 2 years ago, we were friends on Facebook. He had been back to Banks for a short period of time when I met him and to come to Warren, and he found out that I liked to paint. Well, we added each other as friends on Facebook, and one thing led to another. I was uploading just some pictures of what I was kind of spitting out of my little at-home studio, and Ken had moved to Colorado. He was in Montrose, Colorado, about about an hour and 20 minutes away from Telluride, to the north. And Ken had a gallery, and he said, "Man, I think I can sell your stuff." And so we started a semi-representation. We didn't really sign anything, which looking back at it, I probably was an idiot. I didn't know what I was doing. But anyway, I packed up about 12 paintings and drove them to Montrose with my then fiance at the time. And we dropped in a few paintings at this little gallery in Colorado, and that's kind of where my professional art career began. Since then, I've kind of departed from Ken's gallery. Selling in galleries, who in here has had dealings with galleries in the past? It's a hard business, right? It can be. If you're not in a particular market, it can be a struggle. I've worked with a couple of different galleries at this point, and I've had minimal success with galleries. I'll be honest about that. I sell a lot more online. I really do. In fact, the biggest success though that I've had recently, I opened up a pop-up gallery in Warren for 1 month during December. Had no idea I had this many paintings built up, but I had close to 40 original pieces at that point, which of course, if you can imagine all those in one house, my wife was about to kill me if they didn't get out. But anyway, we did get those all in the gallery. I sold over 35 of them. And I don't have any. Now, you know, the way I go into selling art, I have a price, and if a piece is not up to par, I'm willing to lower that. But for the most part, if I know I'm selling directly from myself, I'm willing to drop a price a little bit. So a lot of these pieces were sold for $150, $200 in that area. Some of them, I did sell 2 paintings for about $1,400 a piece, which was nice. Now these were big pieces, so in terms of my formula of how I sell art, which is by the square inch, they were very cheap at $1,400. They probably, had I sent them to Ken in Colorado at the Healthy Rhythm Community Art Gallery out there, they probably would have been around $5,000 just because of his overhead. But selling directly to a customer, I can cut them a really nice deal. But a lot of things have changed even since I worked with Ken. Like I said, I do sell mostly online now. So I sent a piece to Nevada just about 2 days ago. Well, no, it was yesterday. Wow. Actually mailed one to Carson City, Nevada yesterday, which was nice. But that selling online also helps me out. I can open up my subject matter. I can paint what I enjoy to paint because I love the mountains, I love the West, and I love painting Arkansas scenes, but that's not probably what I'm best at, all things considered. So if I'm able to paint outside of my region and still sell, that's a huge thing for me. And it doesn't really matter what I'm painting. In an online world, there's a buyer somewhere. Shipping's always a challenge. It is, especially for bigger pieces. And I'm getting into a little bit more detailed stuff. But you guys are artists. Y'all have probably dealt with this before. I do want to keep this semi-casual here. We're not going to finish the entire painting today, so that's why I'm not jumping into it right off the bat. But so you guys have been through this before. You know how this works. Trying to sell art. It is a hard thing to do because we live in a world where a lot of things are mass-produced. People don't seem to have the joy of. A lot of people don't seem to have that joy of having that absolute original in their hands. They would rather go somewhere and buy something for $20 and $30, and that's just not. We can't get our money back by doing that. So I've thrown out the door any ideas of selling or trying to get my materials down to a bare minimum. So I don't go buy anymore for my professional pieces. I don't go buy cotton canvases. I don't buy cheap paint, which I used to. I really used to do that. I used to skimp every little area that I could. But my whole deal in my entire business at this point is quality. I want it to be absolute, the nicest quality that I can give to my final customer, because that's what they're paying for. They want to know that whoever I am as an artist, because if I'm selling to someone in Nevada, this person actually contacted me about last week, and this is just a good example, but this lady called me and just said, "Hey, I see a painting on your website. Is that a Reep? Is that a print?" I said, no, it's not. And she loved that, because just the general idea of having that original piece. And then when I got into telling her the materials that I use, and the fashion in which I go producing a painting, she was sold. And that's what closed the sale. It wasn't that it was in a decent price range for her. I don't try to gouge my customers, but I certainly don't drop it down to 20 bucks. I'm not going to do that. It's not worth it. I did bring a few pieces. Now this one's older. This is an older painting of mine. Wait just a second, get a drink real quick. Mom, would you hold that?
I can get it.
That's an acrylic, obviously. You guys can probably tell with the kind of matte finish to it. I love to paint dogs. Hunting breeds sell really well for me. This is obviously an old hound. Mom actually bought this one. Dad, that's why I still have it. It was one of the few that survived the big purge that we had in December, where we sold so much art.
I just couldn't turn loose of it. So.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. So the way my painting style really evolves on really a weekly basis. You guys have any experience with that? It does change.
Do you keep yours unframed in order to ship them easier?
I do.
It just seems like that would be the way to go, like when you got your online gallery.
The only time I'm going to frame a painting for a customer, particularly if I'm selling online, is if they're willing to pay the shipping and what it's going to cost to send a heavy frame.
Then you will.
Then I will. But now, for instance, selling or sending even a 30-inch by 40-inch painting may cost, if you send it the right way, the way that's going to get there safe, I mean, you're going to spend easily $200, if not more, because you've got to have it crated properly.
Okay, so
now you could take it off and roll it. You could do that once it's dry. But my sell rate right now is, I usually sell most paintings within about 4 months.
So you think it usually costs you around $200 to ship a painting that size?
Not that size. No, anything 30 by 40 and up gets that oversized charge. And I only ship anything that big. Well, if it's this size, I can send it to the post office. They'll take that. If it gets much bigger than that, though, you have to go FedEx and UPS or UPS, right. One of those two.
You've got to have enough packing.
And I actually don't pack them. What I do, if it gets that big, I bring them up here to pack mail, and I let them crate them for me.
Oh, they will do that?
Yeah, because they're good at it. They do that, and I don't touch that.
Is that new place out Whitehall?
I believe it is.
Yeah, I've mailed a couple of things back through there.
Yeah, they're expensive.
I didn't know they did that though.
They're expensive, but they are experts on it. Yeah.
Well, PAK, isn't it? PAK.
I think it's PAK.
Yeah.
Right past the dentist office.
Now, this painting right here is one of my more recent landscapes.
I got it.
And you guys can tell I'm really heavy on blues, especially in most of my mountainscapes. I love Prussian blue. Ultramarine's a good color, but I really try to use Prussian within my mountains most of the time. But if you guys notice, I consider there's almost a spectrum for me. There's a spectrum of ultra realism to impressionistic. I'm about a quarter of the way. Okay, so what I call my style is impressionistic realism. I'm not trying to be an impressionist painter. That's not what I am. I want, when you're up close to one of my paintings from about the area that you would be painting from, that 2 foot to 6 inch area, if you're really squeezing down on it, in that spot, that depth, it's going to almost look abstract. But I want, when the viewer backs up to about that 6 foot range, 5 to 6 feet, I want all this abstract strokes, all these huge broad strokes to just kind of, bam, come into focus and suddenly be there. And people, I don't know, that's just the style I like. Now, you guys, I've been around other art groups that are, very much on the dead ultra realism side, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can paint that way. This is a style that I've sort of developed for 2 reasons. Number one, I do a lot of painting outdoors, then I'll come back into the studio and do a larger piece. So if I'm painting outside, I've got to be quick with it. I've got to be relatively minimal with my palette. These few colors here, this pretty primary palette that I've got, that's pretty much what I keep inside the studio too. I don't get too crazy with colors. I like to keep it relatively simple. I don't go out and buy, 50 different colors. There's just no, for me, it just kind of gets messy if I do that, and it confuses me. I find that using a minimal palette, I'm able to, almost by instinct now, in fact, I have a YouTube channel, which I'm going to pass out business cards here in a little bit. Let me remind you guys about that. But when I'm teaching students on my YouTube channel, I have to go back and re-record my audio, not because I can't talk while I'm painting, because I can. Miss Rhonda can probably tell you, I talk just fine. It's nothing. While I'm painting, I'm not at a loss for words, but when it comes to colors, I'm very instinctual with it now. And that's just because I use such a minimal palette. But I do, if you guys have any questions throughout this, please shout them out. I'm willing to answer anything I can for you. Sure.
Do you paint most of those from photographs? Or
I have two different ways that I'll go about getting my material. So if I travel, I'm doing two things. In the mornings, for instance, let's just say I take a trip out west for something like this. In the mornings, I'll take my plein air easel, and from like 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., I'm painting. Then, because the light's getting high in the sky, and that's really not a great time to paint, a lot of times just for shadow purposes, at that point, I'll grab my camera. I've got a Canon 5D Mark III, and I'll hop in the car and just start driving, and I'll start taking photographs for reference material. And I'll do that till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At that point, I'll go back to my plein air easel, and I'll paint, a couple more paintings in a day. And between having the finished paintings and having reference material, I can then take the small paintings that I do, go back into the studio, and either say, okay, that one's really horrible, and toss it in the trash, or I can say, okay, well that looks pretty good. That composition's not bad. I need to move this here, but let's blow that up to a larger canvas, and then we'll get a nice one going. So that's kind of where I go, and then I've got the reference material to back that up. But you have to be careful when you take pictures, because obviously sometimes if you have a printer like I do, you don't exactly print the most effective photos in the world. You can go to Walgreens or Walmart and print a nice picture. That's not a problem, but you can get into a mode where you're trying to paint a photo rather than paint a painting. Does that make sense? You can really get into trouble. So a lot of times what I'll do with because I've got a film background, so this kind of aged me a little bit, but sometimes I'll overexpose, or I'll blur it a little bit. Or even in post, I'll go into my computer once I get a photo in, and I'll blur it simply so I can't rely solely on the photo. And that makes a huge difference, because if you get into this business of trying to paint every last little twig, you're gonna get yourself a muddy mess, especially with oil paints. I don't know how many acrylic artists we have in here, because I've done both. I'm experienced with both acrylics and oils. Yeah, you can pick that one up. This one's still in the works. It's not done yet. That's why it's not framed yet.
No, that looks sweet.
I like him.
Yeah.
And you can tell
He
from
lives at our house.
This one lives in your house.
you can tell from the difference in the acrylic over there. That one was done, I think, back in like 2015. So in 3 years, I've gone from this really smooth transition of colors to now. I blend where I need to blend, but then there's other places where I just want to keep my stroke. I'll do one stroke and then I'm off the canvas. I don't hang around too long in one specific spot. I jump around a lot with my brush. There's some things that need to be done here. I need some little bright stalks on some of this grass area here. Very fall color, obviously. But I'm very conservative going into a painting when I go from, I'm conservative with my darks and my lights, so I keep a pretty neutral canvas until the very end. And at that point, I go in and I go, okay, where is it not dark enough? Where is it not light enough? And then you can tell, I'm going to pick one of these back up. Then I go back in, and still not using pure white because that can also get you into trouble. This looks like it's pure white, but that snow has got a lot of yellow in it. It's got a lot of blue in it. It's got some Van Dyke brown in it, if you can believe that or not. As white as it is, that really bright snow has Van Dyke brown in it. And so does the sky. This sky's got a ton of Van Dyke brown in it. Now that's not a color I use when I'm painting outdoors very often, but I do use it in the studio quite a bit. But that snow went in dead last. A little bit of bright light went in dead last. And there was some dark areas on the trees that went in dead last. You know, depending on taste, I've had other artists that have looked at this and gone, well, you really need to soften up the mountains. It's just my personal preference. I didn't want to. I thought it needed a harder line at the top. It's not perfectly hard, but it's got a pretty readable line there. It's very steady. This painting doesn't have a ton of depth in it, which is the only thing I don't think I did very well. And obviously I probably could have done a little bit more work in the water. At this point, do you guys have any questions about this one? Any particular thing I did?
The basin look in the middle, at the very back.
In here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bowl shape. Is that just snow-covered mountain?
Yeah, yeah. This was taken from two different pictures. So I found a photo of a couple of different peaks that were this size that I took while I was out west, and neither one of them had a lake in front. So I went in and just laid in the lake. But yeah, that's just it was a really snowy time while I was there, and that's kind of what happened. We were going to bring another painting up here today that was I think in a similar situation in the area you're looking at there. And most people don't spot it, but you've got a good eye, because even I'm not super okay with that. Okay. Yeah. And I run the risk very oftentimes with my art of hanging out with it too long.
It makes you question it just a little bit.
Yeah.
You know,
so sometimes I have to just say, well, Rob, you've worked on it for 8 hours total. It's time
just
to
let it go.
It's time to let that go. So sometimes there are mistakes, and there's things that there are always things in it. That log in the front right, I hate it. I hate it. I just couldn't get it right. And it's not the log itself; it's where it goes underwater. I didn't execute it very well. And some days we're not going to execute it very well. Some days you're going to have a bad day as a painter. It's like being an athlete to that extent. Some days you're just not on your A game. And there's always little things that I can spot within a painting of mine. I usually don't spot them in anybody else's. That's kind of how we are as artists. Yeah, I have a tough time doing that.
Well,
Yeah.
from this distance, your log thing, I didn't even notice it doesn't
Yeah.
get me. But because your abstract style kind of
Yeah.
lends that to me. And the little bit of that, mine does go to the mountain background, even though you've got the lightest area here. But I still see some depth in. The depth in it.
I thought, you said you didn't think it had that much depth, but I thought it did, so. I don't know, I don't know.
I think my biggest problem with this one so far has been it's got it developed wrong, but it's almost got too many focal points.
You could say,
Maybe.
You know, it just,
it's a
but
lot of picture.
I try not to get too hung up on that. I paint what looks good, and if it doesn't look good to me, it doesn't get in there. But
I think your focal points lead into the painting all the way through the painting.
yeah, you have to move the eye
So it's
around.
not bad.
I like the style. I like the abstract style.
I could have taken, probably if I had a different canvas, I probably could have just cut it, almost cropped it, and done just the clouds could have been a focal point. To me, they're one of the strongest points. But yeah.
That'd
So
be
you,
another painting.
yeah. Well, there's always another one. Well, before I pull this away.
Well, don't you think years that you worked in film, don't you think that trains your eyes to because you creating a picture every film scene that you took, you were
Yeah.
creating a sort of like a photograph in one sense. It was moving.
Well,
I would think that would have influenced you a lot to look what you were looking at when you were decided what to paint.
well, and this one's maybe a bad example of this, but I sometimes get in trouble when I try to morph photos together. When you try to take different elements and move them in, I'm able to move trees wherever I want them. For some reason, that's not a big problem for me. But when you get to a certain point within a painting, at least in my experience, this is all under my experience, because we're all different. But I can go to a point where I've moved so much, and then it almost peaks, and I can't. If I move anything else, it's going to get a little off. I do use all linen for any professional pieces I do. So, has anybody ever painted on linen before?
I did once, but
Yeah.
it was wasting my time.
On that part.
Because I was using acrylic.
Yeah, and that would do it. Linens, there's really not a huge, there is a difference. Linen's stronger. It obviously comes from the flax fibers. And so it's kind of what the old masters would have used. And that's part of the reason I use it, just for that quality that I sell to my customer. But that's not the biggest thing. You can buy a linen canvas that's cheap for the most part. The price comes in for the oil priming, and that's all I use anymore. I don't use gesso at all, which I guess technically you could say oil grounds are a form of gesso, but even gesso is not what the old painters of the Renaissance would have used. They would have used an oil primer. I don't use exactly what they use anymore. They would have used just it's a mixture of certain different pigments along with your linseed and all that, which takes a good year to dry if you do it correctly. And I'm not going to wait that long when painting, so I use alkyd-based oil grounds. And what that does is two things. Number one, I get a more luminescent final painting. Because if you paint with acrylics, once that water evaporates out of it, there's things you can put in your acrylics to change this. I'm not going to say this about all acrylics, because they're certainly an awesome medium. But if you do it just out of the tube, what you're going to end up with is a very flat surface. Yeah. Now there's science behind this, and I'm not the best at explaining it, so just kind of bear with me. You know, there's a textural difference between oils and acrylics once acrylics are dried and oils have oxidized. So the oxidation process happens with oils, and instead of evaporating, the linseed that's used, or it could be walnut oil too, but the linseed oil that's used in oils simply hardens in place. You get these almost little light bulbs, little bubbles, these little microscopic bubbles within oil paint once it oxidizes. And when light penetrates an acrylic painting, it's hitting a surface that's flat, and all that little water base that was in there is gone. So you're left with a flat surface, and the light just simply reflects off of it. You get a flat, kind of dull, matte finish. With oils, the light hits it. It penetrates within the paint, and once it hits all those little hardened bubbles of linseed, I'm simplifying it here, but once it hits that, it almost self-illuminates. And that's why oils are so much more vibrant than acrylics. It's because you get this penetration of light. You have to be careful. You have to varnish them, or else you can ruin them pretty quickly within 100 years. But if you use the correct varnish and it's an oil, a high-quality oil paint, I mean, they're good for 1,000 years or more. And they're just these unbelievable colors, and they just fascinate me. I love it. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little deep here into the oil paints, but that's why I like them so much, is because they're that awesome. But when you use an oil primer, now what I've done here, I have been unable to find any hardboard, or masonite is what we would call it, that is actually oil primed. You can't buy that from an art supplier, at least that I've found. You can buy or linen canvases, or even cotton that's been oil primed. But what I do is I buy my oil grounds. So this came pre-primed with gesso, with acrylic gesso. So I just then go back over with a roller and prime it with my oil primer, and that's done. How many of you have been toned? How many of you toned your canvases before you paint? What does it do for you?
It helps a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
It gives you a middle level of tone to work, start with.
Yeah, that's a huge point. It gives you lay something against a white canvas, and it's so hard to judge the color correctly, especially if you're painting outdoors, because then you've got light changing, and there's a whole another thing going on there. But even if you're in a studio, I urge you to tone your canvas with some sort, and it's really easy to do. You just thin out a paint. You thin out your burnt sienna, burnt umber, raw sienna. It doesn't matter. It can be an earth tone. You can even do it blue or green. Just get it, but I would urge a brown tone. But tone that canvas. You're going to obviously be able to judge your colors better. The other thing it does, you get that painter's block out of the way. You've got this nice pristine canvas. It's just like having writer's block. You don't know what to do. At least that's my experience. So I've got this messed up, ugly thing. It's asking to be fixed at this point, and it needs it. So this gets all of the problems, all that prettiness out of the way for me to be able to work. And that's part of why I tone my canvas. But if y'all, the last point I'll make, and then we'll get into a little bit of painting here. If you decide to oil prime or get an oil prime surface, I use Masterpiece Pro canvases. You're going to use less paint if you're oil painting. You will use so much less paint. Acrylic gesso absorbs. It's built to suck in moisture. And so what ends up happening, even with oil paints, oils aren't meant to be painted on acrylic gesso. You drop paint on there, and you're going to notice when you start to spread it out, it's going to dry out on you. Eventually, it will. And you're not going to be able to carry it as far on your canvas. Now, it's probably relatively minute. It's not enough for you to notice it at first. But I promise you, watch your tubes of paint. If you're painting with oils, try an acrylic surface, then try an oil prime surface. You're gonna notice a difference eventually. You're gonna use less paint. It's gonna save you money. So that's huge for me. That's part of how I keep my cost low enough to be able to purchase really nice canvases. I don't bother making my own canvases. I could, but I don't have a huge shop, so I just don't want to get into all that. That's just not. Now, if you guys are able to do that, I think it looks like a lot of fun. It's something I would like to be able to do, but I just don't have time. I like paint, so it's not. It's just one of those things where I don't want to fiddle with it. Any questions before we get into a little painting?
I really don't understand what the oil prime is,
Yeah.
because when I was taught with oil, we put gesso on there.
Yeah. Well, and when probably until 2 years ago, I was using. Well, even a year ago, I was still using gesso. I didn't buy gesso for anything, but when I was painting with acrylics, I would buy gesso to use as white. But then I would go and I just buy a basic cotton canvas that's pre-primed, pre-triple primed. And I noticed that brushes were tearing up a lot easier, or just tearing up quicker than I wanted them to. And if you're spending money on nice brushes, obviously with oil paints, we're going to tear them up. That's going to happen, so you might as well just get over that. You're going to rip up your brushes at some point. That's why they sell them. You're going to have to buy new ones. But I did notice they were happening really quick. Gesso almost gets a sandpaper-like finish to it. When you're using oil, it's so soft. It doesn't tear them up as quickly. And your oil paints, again, they don't seep into that acrylic gesso. Or they do seep into the acrylic gesso. Oil paints, when you're using oil priming, it just sits on top.
Oh, okay.
It simply sits on top. So you get this really smooth brush stroke, and then you're not using as much paint because it spreads out easier. It doesn't seep down into those little crevices of the acrylic.
Did I hear you say that you put the oil prime over gesso?
You have
at times.
At times. And I do that with my panels. Now, I I don't know what they do at the factory with the linen canvases. I know they have to use like a sizing, like a PVA sizing or something to kind of seal off the canvas. You can't just drop gesso or oil priming onto a canvas. It'll basically rot it away. So they do use like I think the old masters would have used rabbit skin glue to actually coat the canvas. And that's what Masterpiece Pro does. They actually use I assume a rabbit skin glue, which is really expensive if you do it the right way. But when it comes to these panels, you could go to Home Depot, Lowe's, you could buy a 4x8 sheet of hardboard, which is Masonite. The Masonite used to be the brand. But you could buy the sheet of hardboard, you could cut it down, you could make these super cheap. I don't have time, I just don't like doing that. So what I do is I buy the acrylic primed, and then they're already gessoed. And so then I just take a little roller, a little mini roller, and I roll my oil priming over it.
See, I don't think I knew you could oil prime over
Yeah,
the gesso, so that's good information.
Well, that new Masonite, and I just had an example of this, a girl bought the Masonite and her husband cut the size she wanted. It was Nancy. And then a friend up here told me that there's an oil finish on that, and I painted it in acrylic. I put down acrylic base and made it white. But do you know anything about that?
It's probably going to be the difference between tempered and untempered, I would assume, because the tempered has oil used in the actual production of the board itself. Now, there's different artists who will tell you different things, whether to use that or use the untempered. I've never had the luxury of knowing what this is. I think this is tempered, so I would assume this has the oil already in it. What the difference is, one of them will warp and one of them won't if you don't do it correctly, the priming surface. And which warping would be a bad thing to happen. So you have to be careful. I've just never had any experience with it. I've never had a single panel warp.
Well, this was given to me and it was brown.
Yeah. It's I'll just show you. If you guys, anybody who's never used a Masonite panel, let me take this off real quick. And so you just get a solid,
Right.
and usually they're a little thicker than what they actually sell at Hobby Lobby. If you buy them from the store, they're going to be a little thicker. You might even have to sand it down. They're going to have like a soft side to them sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not soft. It's like a grid pattern on it almost.
Right.
And you can take then a sander. You can sand that down and then prime
This
it.
was the same on both sides.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, I don't know.
That's got to be the tempered. That's got to be a tempered difference. And I'm assuming that this is tempered. I've never actually looked it up. I don't know for sure.
But now you're going to paint on the other side?
I'm gonna paint on this side right here.
That you've added the.
Yeah. So all I did, I took my oil primer, which I use Gamblin brand. I like Gamblin products. Gamblin is a company that's really pushing ahead in terms of creating safe studio products. So I work in my studio's in my home. I have one room that's nothing but painting, and obviously my ventilation is decent, but it could be questionable if you're using anything really toxic. And if you're using odorless paint thinner, you may not be smelling it, but you're still breathing it in, and you're still getting those toxins. And I switched to using that about a year ago. I switched over to using Gamsol for all of my cleaning. It's much less toxic, and it's just safer to use inside. So I oil prime my panel, then I go back, and once that's dry, after about 2 weeks, I just take a mix of Gamsol and burnt sienna or some other color that I want to tone with. What I've done on this one, I laid a really thin but heavy amount on here, and then I took a paper towel and wiped it off, and that's what gives me this tone. The other good thing it does is if you miss a spot during the painting process, you've technically painted it. It's not going to be white, so that works. Okay. I'm getting the word that I need to hurry this up, so we will.
I have practice.
All right. So what we're going to do. Again, we're not going to be able to finish this whole thing, but I went out yesterday. I was trying to figure out something to paint for you guys. And this is probably the most difficult part of the process for me is coming up with a subject. Because nothing I see looks really good enough to me in real life. It just doesn't. So I have to really struggle with that. That's a weakness of me as an artist, is picking out something and then composing it correctly on a canvas. But I went down to my little local county park, which has a small creek that's not small right now because of all the rain we've had. And it's, over the years, it's carved out, over thousands of years, it's carved out this huge bluff within this park. And so I've got this pretty large, almost cliff face here. And this is not a typical landscape scene that I would do, but I want to urge you guys, when you go out to paint, and Ms. Rhonda, I haven't actually brought this up in our class, but push your limits. That's really taken me a lot further in sales, even, of paintings. When you push the limits of what you think you should or can paint, you get all kinds of great results. I did a painting a couple of weeks back of the Saline River, or actually probably a month ago. And I did it, and I took a photo, a square photo, out of 14 by 14 inch canvas. And it was just a weird view. It was a very different perspective than anybody would probably take or try to conceive a painting from that perspective. But it sold in a week because it was just so different. So that's kind of what this is. This is going to be an attempt at different. I have never tried to paint this before, so you guys are here with me for an adventure today. I like the colors. I've got these beautiful blues down here and this little green. This is just a really dirty little brook running through. So we're just going to start, and I hope you guys don't mind. We've got a small panel here, but I hope you guys can kind of follow along with me. And I'm just going to show you the process that I go through to get a painting going. So I want my brush a little moist with the Gamsol. And what we want to do is we're actually going to start with the cliff. I'm not going to start with the sky. This is a little different. Mom, would you pass out those business cards? Or they don't? Okay. My YouTube channel's on there. If you have a computer, feel free to go to it. I've got free lessons, and they're long. They're really long. Check them out. One of the things I've changed in my painting style over the last 6 months has been the fact that normally now I paint my sky last, or at least towards the mid portion of the painting. Particularly if I have any trees with needles or leaves in them. And that helps me to blend a little bit better. I found when I went outside to paint a lot, I paint this really gorgeous sky, then I needed a tree line. Well, I hadn't planned it out real well. The tree line needed to be higher than I had it, than where I had the sky ending. And so what ends up happening is you get this muddy little line because you've mixed in with white paint. So this just kind of keeps you safe until you need the sky. All right. I know you guys back here are probably getting blocked off. I'll try to stand to the side
That's all right. That's all right.
as much as I can. I'm just going to take some burnt sienna, a little bit of sap green, ultramarine blue, and some white. And I'm just going to try to establish the horizon line. Need a little bit more Gamsol. My brush got a little bit too dried out with that paintbrush.
When you say Gamsol, is that about the same as Turk that we would use?
It's just a safer version of it.
Okay, it's not linseed oil.
Nope, not linseed oil. Now, when I'm painting outdoors, I only carry Gamsol with me. When I'm in the studio, I use linseed oil instead to thin out my stuff.
Oh, okay.
I don't like to use linseed in the studio, in outdoors. It's just more weight. You know, when you're hiking a mountain, it's
Sure,
you
yeah.
don't want to carry too much with you. So any little thing you can leave out, you do.
These tables are a weird size.
All right, now I'm not worried too much about detail at any point. I really don't worry about detail much at all, the style that I paint, until the very end. And I'm just getting big broad strokes in, just covering canvas. Now I'm going to go ahead and just kind of make the little indication. There's not a tree over here, but I'm just going to kind of scrub in a little shape just to get one in. Now that back, there's this little area that I'm painting is actually in shadow. The cliff that's in front of it's going to be in light. So I'm going to add some cad red and cad yellow deep. Of course, our titanium white's the typical white that I use, and that's the, I'm actually going to add some orange. I didn't have any orange on my palette. I'm sorry I talked so long, guys. I was going to try to do more painting for you. We may kind of jump around here and not get a totally finished painting, but I'll try to show you all the different elements of how this works. I think I've got a decent color mix now. We've got a little drop off, so we're going to need to kind of lighten this up a little bit to get that a little brighter. And every time I go back to my palette, I'm going to pick up slightly different colors. I like just the little shifts. They're not drastic, but they're enough just to create the illusion of detail. Now we're doing this in a style that I would do in terms of painting outside, and I'm even probably working it a little quicker than I normally would. And I'm turning my brush every different kind of way just to get little different effects. You guys know about underpaintings though, they're never pretty, right? Do a few little switches in light, just so we'll keep kind of controlling that light with this titanium white and a little bit of orange and yellow. Especially a huge dirt wall is what this is. Now it's got some some stratification in it that goes sideways, but we're back far enough that you really can't pull out much of that detail. A pretty good bit of light on this right side. And I'm using a number 6 bristle.
Kind of flat.
This is maybe a bright. I always forget the difference. You guys, I use brights a lot. I do have I have a number 3 bright that I use a lot at home. I think the difference is basically on the end. I think they're round. The brights may be a little bit more rounded.
Oh, there's
They
another
may have
word
a
for
little
that
curl to
too.
them.
That's another word. It's rounded at the tip.
Yeah, that's my favorite brush. I thought when you said bright, that was the softer bristles to do, like for the finishing.
Yeah, they're. Of course, I typically, if I want a softer brush, I just go to synthetic. I actually don't use any sables that are not, well, I don't use any true sables. Even my liner that I have is a synthetic. I just, to me, I find little one brush that I like, and I kind of buy about 4 of them. That's what I use.
The one you like the best, you lose most.
Exactly, that's the truth. Okay. Now, what we're going to do, I'm going to take you guys. Do we have? How are we doing on time?
We're fine.
Okay.
Okay.
What we're going to do,
Just worry about your mom.
we're going to work on some of these shadows and just get the shadow in the big bulk of that big color mass on the left, and then the same similar color of shadow on the right. We're going to work on getting that in. You can do this with. There's a lot of heavy blues in there in this dark area. And that's a challenge, is to try to find what color is in a dark area. What is that color? And my picture may not be exactly accurate, but I like the blues in it. So we're going to use a little bit of a combination of ultramarine and Prussian. I think. I say these things, and then when you get on the palette, it sometimes can be a little different. We're just going to start up here, and I'm just going to work kind of in a side area, preserving that light color, but I'm a messy painter in some ways because I don't worry about mixing colors that probably aren't in what I'm using. So I'm kind of just slowly going into the darker ultramarine. I'm going to start to pull in some Prussian. Prussian is super strong. If you haven't used it before, you can make a mess in a hurry.
Does it have just a little bit of turquoise in it?
Prussian gives a nice little, of course when it comes out of the tube it looks black, but then you get this gorgeous color.
It's almost a turquoise hint to it.
All right, I'm going to soften that, kind of fight it with some burnt sienna. There's always counter colors that you can use. And I know the question on everybody's tongue right now, does he know the color wheel very well? No, I do not. I actually don't have one. I don't own a color wheel. I've never touched one.
Why not?
I just know what works.
It's round.
Yeah. I did know that.
Well, I'm identifying with you.
He called home on his first day of college with a list of supplies that he had to have for this art class he was going to take, that he had to have for a computer major. And after about 15 items on the list, which was 2 pages long, we decided he needed to change his major.
I don't think I would have done very well in art school. You guys remember I said that I I'm very conservative with my darks and my lights at the beginning of the painting. I'm probably taking this pretty light right now. This little area, it could be darker, but I can go back later and you can always darken it. I'm not very oftentimes a painter in an alla prima style or wet on wet is what Bob Ross would paint. Everybody knows who Bob Ross is. I kind of use him a lot in the teaching, but you know, he does paint in what's technically alla prima or all at once. I'm more than willing to let a painting dry for a week and tack up before I go back into it. So I do paint dry quite often. It can take me, usually most paintings take me about a month to really get through.
Before I forget, how long do you let a painting dry before you would sell it and ship it to someone? If you were having to ship it.
Yeah, if you were, that's a good question for varnishes. If you're going to varnish a painting, you know, you get varnished and you'll say wait 6 to 12 months. I don't do that. I wait maybe a month to 2 months.
Yeah,
and if the top of it's dry, it's good to varnish. Now, if you've got a really thick impasto, you wouldn't want to do that
before you varnish. But when you're actually finishing one and someone's bought one online and you're shipping it to them, how long would you have let it dry?
I would probably wait 3 to 4 months.
Okay,
before I
that's
ship
good
it.
information.
Yeah, especially like I said, if you have that thick impasto, the second anything presses down on it, it's just glue and it's going to just it's going to wipe off. Yeah, all it is the top's just oxidized. All right, so we're going to darken this up a little bit, and we're just using ultramarine. I'm going to add a little bit of dioxazine purple. There's really, if you want to get black, I never use black paint because it's just not natural. Nothing wrong though if you want to use black. I don't want to tell anybody they can't use black, but I just don't. But you can take burnt sienna, ultramarine, and dioxazine purple, or violet if you want to use violet. We can mix up a really deep, almost black color, but it's not black, and therefore it's got a natural landscape feel to it. If you guys watch my YouTube videos, you will notice I don't paint a lot. You're witnessing that right now. A lot of the work that I do is just in trying to get the color right. It's all done on the palette. All right, I think we've got a decent color here. We're going to lighten it up as we've got a little bit of ground. There's a big mass here with some trees growing out of it. And I try to think of everything in a landscape painting as some sort of a piece of a mass. So I'm going to segment it off in my mind. And that was just one huge mass. I wasn't worried about too much shape other than just getting that blocked in. And now I'm going to do the same thing just with a lighter color in this area. Okay. I'm going to clean my brush and we're going to get started on this water. Notice how bold the strokes are. I'm not painting in a very fine fashion. And that middle landscape over there, that mountain scene, was done in this exact same way. Now, if you can imagine, if you're like me and if you like to work on larger canvases, I mean, I'll very oftentimes paint on a 60-inch canvas. If you're painting even in this big broad style, once you back up, you've got a lot of detail.
When you go to a larger canvas, do you go to a much larger brush?
Largest I'll go is maybe I guess it would technically be like a 30 or 40 number, which would be like the 1 inch, like a 1 inch brush. I used to spend money on those big, huge, almost abstract brushes, but I don't use them. I typically will not use anything much bigger than this number 6.
Okay.
I've got 3 brushes in my plein air set, and I hardly ever use this one. This is a pretty big brush. I usually use my number 3.
You use small brushes, don't you? Or do you?
Okay, now this watercolor
Big brushes.
has got a lot of green and a lot of yellow in it. And it's actually, I think, got some burnt sienna as well. It's amazing how throughout the entire painting you kind of look around and you go, oh, those all have the same color combinations in them. They're just different values. Actually, one of the paintings that I sold for $1,400 in my pop-up gallery had, I think, it had 4 colors in it, the whole painting. It was a duck hunting scene.
Did you sell it to a native?
I actually sold it to one of our local banks.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
great.
They had been showing it for some time. They had a deal where they let local artists put paintings in their building. And they just built a brand new building. They had these 2 huge walls, and this painting, of course, looked great in there. When I started the gallery, I pulled them out to try to sell them, and I had a couple of people who were starting to show interest in them, so I called the guy that runs the bank, and I said, hey, I think these may be about to go. I just want to let you know. And he said, no. We want them.
Good.
Sometimes you have to kind of.
Give them a little push.
Yeah. Well, we have to be self-marketers. Don't forget that.
I think that's most of us, the artists, us people that do it, whether we've been a teacher or we just started painting, marketing is our weakest skill.
Oh, I can't do it at all.
See, that's why we need to do online galleries.
Get my computer to work.
That's kind of important, Neil.
That's a full back for you.
That'd be an important step.
For this water, what I'm going to do is, the biggest difference is I'm going to turn my brush stroke sideways here. Now this isn't a hard, fast rule, but just in this area, that's what I'm going to do. Constantly changing that color just a slight bit as I go. I've got a huge pop of almost a brown yellow. It's really bright. I'm going to really take the titanium white to this, along with that cad yellow deep.
Take that corner, that'd be pretty nice. You know where that is? Down on Middle Warren Road, Troy Hankins.
Oh.
Horse.
Okay. I didn't know it had that
Take
water in
the
front of
barn
it.
out. And I've got that horse, I don't know if that would be.
That'd be good.
I don't know.
That's where the Calvary Church is.
But I just thought this water was great.
There's not a lot of that.
Had plenty to choose from.
We could paint lots of water in the last
So we got a lot of
one.
water right now.
Oh, my. Everything looks like a lake, even beside the road in different places.
And some rocks coming out. Sure, if I'm not in trouble, I'll call you.
I've not been happy with video I've done, so.
I'm gonna take the horse in the barn
I thought you meant a real horse, I didn't notice that.
Yeah. A real horse would be good.
Yeah, it was.
Just bring him down a little bit. Can't be up there in the sky.
Now, what would you do over that underpainting on the water to make it look real? I mean, are you gonna put,
Yeah, well, once I get done with the underpainting, I would go back in and essentially just start looking for the smaller shapes. So right now I'm painting in big blocks, big mass shapes. Then I go back on top of that. And water's great, especially with oils, because you can paint them all in the same day. And I would not, the first thing I would do is if I finished this in the field, we're painting this like I would be outside. I do the underpainting and then I'm back into the studio. And it's not gonna look like anything yet. It's just gonna look like a weird.
Underpaintings that you're doing plein air.
Yeah, since I'm doing it in plein air.
Your basic shades in there.
I get back and this water it's gonna look a lot like this when I get back into the studio. Then I'll take my smaller brush while it's still wet and I'll start pulling in the next colors and just layer upon layer of trying to get different smaller shapes and detail it as I go in. But the underpainting stage here is all just about getting these massive shapes, these huge shapes in. And that's one of the things that I think Miss Rhonda, there you are. I think in our classes in Warren that I probably haven't been able to bring in as much. We get this idea that paintings happen because we've watched awesome artists like Bob Ross. We get the idea that they just happen in 30 minutes.
Sure, yeah,
They just don't.
No, they don't.
Not really good art doesn't. Mine doesn't. If there's anybody out here that can do it, I'm envious.
But the longer you paint, the more easily you will come up with this exact color that you're fighting for right now.
Yeah, yeah. And the more confidently you can attack it.
I'm not at that stage, but it sounds nice.
Well, I don't know that any of us ever are at that total stage. I think it's a constant journey. So this shape here that I painted in earlier, these two colors are about to almost blend together. But again, when I go back in detail, there's going to be little separating elements that go in. And some of those would need to let it dry. Some would have to let it dry to make that happen. But I'm not concerned right now. See, I just went into that really heavy. I'm not concerned about that. That's not... Because some blending is okay. Blending can be used to your advantage. And I'm not putting in the whites yet that's in this little darker area. There's a nice little sparkle on the water, but I'm not going to put that in until later.
Do you find you learn a lot by teaching?
I do. Teaching has... Well, and especially the YouTube channel, because the YouTube channel has really grown in the past six months.
I don't understand how you get money for that.
Well, I don't until I can get to a certain point where I can start advertising on it. I've had YouTube channels that have been successful in the past, and you just have to build them. They just have to get built up.
And you take videos of you're doing this very thing.
I sure do. the whole process though.
And you're talking about it as you go.
And I usually don't do commentary while I'm painting. I'll go back and re-record that in the studio.
Gotcha.
Because I like to be able, there's a concentration factor for me. I really like to be able to
Right.
hone in on it. Notice I haven't changed brushes yet. Guess I'm feeling bold today.
Miss Rhonda wants to know where that big brush is.
See, I like big brushes.
I've used them in the past.
He uses them teaching acrylics.
Big brushes with a real sharp point.
He's talking about big.
Oh, wide ones? Yeah. Well, those are nice to put your background in. Where y'all going?
We're just walking
I'm
around.
walking over to
Everybody's
see.
walking, you've been sitting here all the time, where you see, some of us just moving around.
From the
You
other
want me to
folks.
let you sit down in my seat?
No.
It's a good
Good
place.
for that.
I think we are going to switch to a slightly smaller brush. Finally.
Well, since you're not, we'll get all the way through, you kind of blew me off, my mind a little stray when you said you don't do your sky until after you put all your trees in.
Sure.
But I guess with acrylic, it works real good my way, but with oils, I can see why that would get muddy. But I still kept picture putting that sky in after you put all your tree branches in.
Well, let's deal with that.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, let's deal with that. This painting's a little different in how it's set up, just because I took this, it's kind of a winter scene, so we don't have a bunch of leaves on the trees. If you were doing a background of a painting, it would really show through, but I'll kind of use this little area in here, I'll kind of use that to explain what I mean by it. I had an experience, I keep saying 6 months ago, but that's about when it happened. It had to be early fall, sometime in there. I was out, had a pretty nice day, and I had an old French easel I took out to paint, and I was just painting a field. And again, I dropped my sky too far. And I like, very oftentimes, if I'm painting with a portrait setting, I like to have my sky really high. Of course, you know, with the rule of thirds, you don't want to put anything in the middle. That's a bad idea. So you want to get it somewhere in here, or down in here. If you're gonna, you can have a big sky. And sometimes I'll even drop a skyline even this far. I'll really get extreme with it. So the problem that I came up with, I painted in this really nice sky, and then all of a sudden I realized I had it too low. So then you got to put trees in, and you end up with every little stroke of putting in a leaf, or not a leaf, but you know, a mass of a group in the background. You end up picking up this little bit of paint, and it just constantly is devaluing that tree color. And it makes it a little bit more difficult to blend it if you're not paying attention. So what I ended up doing, we've got a decent little Prussian blue here mixed up, so we'll just take some white. The next painting I did, I'd seen another artist do this on YouTube, and I decided to give it a try. We're gonna take Prussian blue and burnt sienna for this sky, because I want to gray it. I don't want it too strong. Kind of go up here. Probably may have used a bit too much burnt sienna, so we'll just get a little bit more white. And what ends up happening, usually I'll just start at the top, but you can start at the bottom if you want to. I'm going to start at the top this time. And I'm just going to start painting this sky in. This is not going to be one of those, I don't want this sky to be too bright. So now that I've got my brush about where I want it in terms of how much paint's left in it, get a little bit more. And I'm going to start down here. And so just pretend that that's in the deep horizon. And I'm just going to carefully paint around the edge. I've got a little bird hole. I call them bird holes. And let's say we maybe there needs to be one down in here. Okay. And we finish off the sky. So I want you to come up, if you don't mind, real quick, and just take a look. This is still underpainting. That's what this would be. But if that was a deep horizon tree,
Yeah, it wouldn't matter if it,
Yeah.
if it was in a shadow.
so what ends up happening when light comes through trees, the trees are not only affected by the light that's then reflected back to your eye picks up a little bit of that tree tone, the same colors that are in the leaves. So if you blend a little bit of that into the tree, inside those little bird holes that you pick up, you end up getting a little bit of that tree color rather than the other way around. You don't have this big bright white. And to me, it just looks more natural, but that's just for me. And I know it seems so backwards from what we were always taught, from what anybody's ever really thrown out there. I'm not the first one to do this though. This has not been a plein air painter's knowledge for a long time. A lot of old painters who used to paint outdoors, this is where that started. Because if you're painting wet on wet in the studio, you can, well, not wet on wet, but if you're painting in the studio, you can afford to let it dry. If you're painting outdoors, you can't do that. You don't have that luxury.
Right.
So that's what this opens up. Now, I'm going to do the same thing, even though we've got this mass of ground, which is pretty close. That still needs to be blended a little bit with the sky, because it's going to have some haziness to it.
Well, everything reflects on everything else.
It does, and that's what you end up getting. Now, I'm not going to, one of the things I'm not going to do, that I was doing down here with the water, I didn't mind going into that. I've got to be careful now not to drift into that. But this is possible with even serious detail. I've done my latest YouTube video was painting an old movie theater sign. And I did the same thing. I painted the sign before I painted the sky. And it worked just as well. But it wasn't blended. I just was very careful. Now, this is where the toning becomes very important. If you haven't toned this, you're going to have white canvas showing through. Because I'm not laying on thick paint. I'm actually really scrubbing out paint that's already in the brush. But it's almost a dry brush. You can almost get a sense, because I'm painting a little bit into here, you can almost get a sense that that light's reflecting off that hill and there's a little bit of a roll to it now. It's not just a flat surface.
You can see that.
This style of painting is not going to win anybody any track contest. It can be methodical and slow. I do think we need to darken up some shadows before we move forward. What time do we have, Mom?
About 3:40 right now.
Okay. I don't like to put a lot of paint out onto my palette when I initially start. There's a sense of waste when I do. What's that?
You fit right in with this group. They really don't like to waste space. I'm just saying.
I end up wasting a lot.
That's what's crazy.
He had one lady in one of his classes that was trying to put acrylic back in the tubes. I told her, I said, don't worry about it. She said, yeah, I need to put this back in the tube.
Get it back in the tube.
She did, I was surprised.
Wow.
She got it in, she would get air in it.
Oh,
Make it
my
suck it back up,
word.
yeah. Yeah, I've seen that.
Rob, do you do workshops, son? Okay.
I do, I'm open to anything.
Oh, okay. Well, do you have a certain number that you want in the workshop, or?
I like to usually, less than, around 15 max. Any more, you kind of get,
Sure.
well, you can't really give
Right.
detailed instruction to anybody.
Okay.
Now, I don't, when it comes, I've had people approach me for parties. I do have people that have done like, well,
Yeah.
and unless people have their own supplies for oils, we usually, I have all the supplies to do up to 10 people with acrylics. But I like to do oils. That's really my preference.
Okay.
So
So
if
you
people
would-
have that ability to
You
bring their
would
own
rather
stuff.
they would have their own oil?
Yeah, that's my preference. We're gonna we'll drop in one or two of the big trees, and then we'll kind of call this a basic underpainting.
Okay.
When he does these other workshops, and he does them in acrylic.
Yeah, so we're able to move a lot quicker, and
But you would do an oil painting.
yeah, oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Like a day one.
Yeah, and we could even, if somebody wanted to do something and they wanted to pick the subject, I'm okay with that. I can do about anything.
Well, even when I taught high school, I didn't make everybody paint the same picture.
Yeah,
You know.
it's
I don't
We
like
made
that
people
where
paint
10
the
people
same
sit
picture,
around
but we
and paint
couldn't
the
tell it
same
when they
picture.
got through.
Well, right, because
Everybody saw it differently. He would be up there telling them to do this small stroke, and I'd look over there and say,
Yeah,
okay.
right.
They didn't look alike.
all right. I'm going to paint in the dark side of the tree first. I'm actually going to get this picture just so I can make sure I get this generally shaped correct. All three of these big trunks, for the most part, have this one on the right has it mostly dark. We've got a pretty big light spot there. We may change that, but they've all got kind of a really nice highlight side to them. So I'm not going to paint the whole tree dark and then go back over it with light. I'm going to paint half of it and then go back with the other half.
What is your biggest joy in painting?
Solitude.
Really?
I love. I'm the only child, so it's a. But I grew up playing every team sport you can imagine. I love to play baseball, and while I enjoyed that, by the time I was kind of burned out of all of it, and then film came along. So painting gives me a sense of solitude that I just really don't get any other way. Plus, it's something that I found that I wasn't terrible at. So it helps when you're not. It helps when you can do it.
Right. I understand that.
I'm not a master. I'm not trying to toot my own horn by saying that. I'm really not. It's something that I feel almost like I was meant to do it.
You can do
You know.
this.
it's got these huge trunks, or these huge roots that are just barely hanging on the ground. So I'm just putting in the dark segments of those.
Now, where, this is in Warren,
Yep, this is in Warren.
it's not a cypress.
No, I actually think these are oaks.
Oh,
My picture's not that
There are
great.
no knees there, so I don't.
Yeah,
know
there's no
if it's
knees, there's no cypress
maybe
trees
some
there.
water, is there water oak?
Yes, there is. Got one in my yard.
Going back in with a slightly darker color
What
just to,
Fred says anyway.
That's what,
That's what Freddie says. I don't know what kind of oak it is. He says it's a water oak.
If you haven't been to this park, it's a beautiful place. A lot of acreage there. It's got a big, I call it pond, they call it a lake. It's got a big pond with ducks.
all right, normally what I would do, since I've got these trees layered, I would clean my brush, move into a light color, highlight that, and then move on. And go. But I'm gonna try something here. I'm just gonna stay with the same color, paint all in, and then I'll go back in with my light after that.
you're gonna teach the first art class for Shepherd Swims.
Don't know what I've done yet.
Judge.
Thank goodness I got it up for all the others.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
That's the cool thing. We had a
We've always had a good crowd that was.
I'm thinking about doing a water color, but put down some structural lines with granite,
A new teacher.
so that when you go back and do more washes, you don't eradicate those. You know, like
I didn't
some dark spots that are in the, I have an example in a book. If I get around to doing it next week.
The girl that I know, the teachers,
So you're gonna go down Friday.
I go down Saturday too.
anyway, I was thinking there was 3 dudes. One of the ones in Jack Rose.
So it's a matter of really
Man, if you ever got persuaded yourself,
packing it all up.
teachers' names. And they'll just, her little grandson goes to Reach Way, so she just sent him in there to get out to the board.
But
Okay.
I might,
I got that one.
I'll work on it, okay?
And I was so, no, I didn't, because I just put art teacher, because I was really frustrated with
Got
myself.
a
Because
pretty
when they turned
large trunk right here, so you're gonna see kind of how I deal with it. If I've got to put something in behind, I just tilt the brush and just paint it in behind without going over that other tree.
It's beginning to take shape, isn't it?
It's kind of, yeah, you're starting to kind of, it's still underpainting, but you're still getting a,
You're getting more skeleton.
yeah, it's getting there. All right, I gotta add some more white to the palette. I hope this has been semi-intriguing.
It's been very informative,
Yes.
very, yes.
And,
I stress this to all of my students that a lot of times they don't come together until you're like 80%, that you're not able to even see them.
No, you teach on YouTube, and then you teach, where do you teach your classes?
We normally I've got a good friend that owns a pizza place in Warren.
Oh, and
he has a room in the back.
He lets you use his room. I've always thought about that there should be places like these libraries and places that have, I knew the library in Conway, my sister used to work there, and one of the artists in Conway, you know, she used, and they didn't even have to pay to use it, you know. If they just had to sign up for it for when she was doing an art workshop there.
Well,
But she always contributed a nice contribution to them for their, you know, general fund, for extras out of what she made.
Well, David always kids me. We do it on a Monday night usually, And he has Tuesday night buffet, so he's got a lot of people there. But Monday night's usually pretty dead.
Yeah, not so many
He
people
says,
going.
you know, you get about 10 cars out front.
People
It
want
starts
to
to
looks
look
good.
better.
Yeah.
That's a smart idea.
He needs to, they need to
They
come
wanna
and
go
eat
see what's
pizza
happening
before the
in there.
class.
All right, this highlight that we're going to use, I'm just going to go with that same mixture that I had for this light back here. I'm going to start in that. I'm going to lighten it and change it a little bit. I'm just going to start with some heavy titanium white in that spot. Grab a hair of orange. Maybe a little bit more than that. Some yellow. And believe it or not, there's like a little bit of sap green in this. It's not much, but it's there. You've got a little bit of that mossy stuff that can grow on trees. And notice I'm really quick with everything. I don't hang out too long on it. When you get back into the detail work, that's when you start kind of slowing it down.
Jerry's not here, is she?
No, she's gonna be gone.
She's on the trip, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
she'll be gone March and April.
Somebody's semi-retired, they go for weeks at a time
We
sometimes.
have enough stuff to take for the daffodil.
And notice how that little stroke right there just really sets that tree
It does.
into the foreground. One stroke can totally move it. And we're going to do the same thing on this little branch. We're going to put a little right there and wrap that out. So that just really...
I have to have a smaller brush. Where you get it?
All right, so that's the first 10% of the painting. That's really the first 10%. There's going to be a lot more that goes into this, and the water, of course, doesn't look like much yet, and it never will until you get to that 80% mark. It's going to start to come together.
You have my email, send me a picture when
I
it's
sure
done.
will. Yeah, I sure will.
I'll show everybody.
I hope y'all enjoyed it. I'm sorry we couldn't get your entire one. I probably shouldn't have talked quite as long early on.
That's
But
all right. I think it's very enjoyable, and I believe we will be interested in a workshop, and we'll contact you later.
absolutely, please do.
Because we don't get oil painters very often.
Oh, really?
It's mostly acrylic, and pastel, and watercolor. So.
If you're looking for an oil painter, I'm guilty as charged.
Yeah, well, I think you did a super job. We enjoyed it.
We have a resident.